The envelope lay on Dong Chang'an Avenue like a splash of blood against the wet pavement. Red paper gleaming under the streetlights in a way that made Jian's stomach clench with something between hunger and dread. He had been walking for 3 hours now, his shoes worn thin and his pockets empty, searching for work that didn't exist and hope that had long since abandoned him. The night air in Beijing carried the scent of exhaust and distant rain, and normally Jian would have hurried past such an object. Everyone knew the stories about red envelopes found in the street, about the obligations they carried, about the prices they demanded. But desperation makes fools of even the wisest men, and Jian had not eaten in 2 days. He stopped walking and stared at the envelope, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. 3 times he started to walk away, and 3 times something drew him back. It wasn't just hunger, though, that gnawed at him like a living thing. It was the way the red paper seemed to pulse with its own inner light, the way it lay so perfectly centered on the pavement, as though placed there specifically for him to find. Jian crouched beside it, his knees protesting against the cold concrete. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, warning him about gifts from the dead, about red envelopes that appeared where no celebration had been, about the terrible reciprocity that bound the living to the departed. She had told him stories during the long winter evenings of his childhood, tales of ghost marriages and spiritual deaths, of the restless dead who sought to drag the living into their endless obligations. "Never take money from the street, little one," she had said, her weathered hand stroking his hair. "The dead are generous with their gifts, but they always expect payment in return." But his grandmother was 3 years buried, and the dead, Jian had learned, were far more generous than the living. The envelope felt thick between his fingers, expensive in a way that spoke of old money and older traditions. No name was written on the outside, no indication of its intended recipient. But inside, he could feel the weight of bills, real money, perhaps enough to keep him alive another week. He held it up to the streetlight, trying to see through the red paper, and for a moment thought he glimpsed characters written inside in ink so black it seemed to absorb light. A taxi splashed through a puddle nearby, sending cold water across his shoes and breaking the spell that had held him frozen. Jian slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket and hurried home, the paper burning against his ribs like a fever. With each step, it seemed to grow heavier, more insistent, until he found himself almost running through the narrow Hutong alleys toward his building. His apartment was a single room above Mrs. Wei's dumpling shop, reached by climbing a narrow staircase that smelled of cooking oil and old wood. The building had been constructed in the 1950s and showed its age in the way the floors creaked and the walls let in the cold. But it was cheap, and cheap was all Jian could afford. He had lived there for 8 months now, ever since losing his job at the electronics factory, and every day Mrs. Wei reminded him that her patience had limits. Inside his room, with its bed that doubled as a couch and its table that doubled as a desk, Jian finally allowed himself to breathe. He pulled the envelope from his pocket and held it under the bare bulb that hung from the ceiling. The red was deeper than he had first thought, the color of garnets or fresh blood, and the paper itself seemed to shimmer slightly in the yellow light. It was beautiful in a way that made him uncomfortable, too perfect for something found abandoned on a city street. When he opened it, his hands trembled slightly. The bills inside were crisp and new, 500 yuan that represented more money than Jian had seen in months. He counted them slowly, savoring the weight of each note, the clean smell of fresh currency, enough for rent, for food, for the luxury of choice that had become so foreign to him. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would feel like to walk into Mrs. Wei's shop tomorrow and pay his debt in full, to see the surprise on her face when he produced real money instead of promises and excuses. But underneath the bills was something else. A piece of rice paper so thin it was nearly transparent, folded with the careful precision of someone accustomed to handling precious things. Characters were written on it in ink so black it seemed to drink the light around it, elegant calligraphy that spoke of education and refinement. John's ability to read classical Chinese was limited. His education had ended at 16 when his parents died in a bus accident, but he could make out enough to understand the basic meaning. It was a marriage contract. His hands began to shake as he read the names. Lin Meihua, daughter of Lin Weidong, deceased at the age of 23. The groom's name had been left blank, waiting to be filled in by whoever claimed the envelope. The dowry was listed as considerable: property, jewelry, and a sum that made the 500 yuan in his pocket seem like pocket change. At the bottom, in smaller characters, was a date: tonight. Jian set the contract on his table and stared at it, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Ghost marriages were stories his grandmother told, relics of a superstitious past that had no place in modern China. They belonged to rural villages where old women still burned incense for ancestral spirits, and young people fled to the cities to escape the weight of tradition. They didn't happen in Beijing, not in the 21st century, not to people like him. Yet here was the evidence, delicate as tissue and undeniable as death itself. He reread the contract 3 times, searching for some indication that it was a mistake or an elaborate prank. But the calligraphy was too perfect, too expensive to be the work of someone playing jokes on strangers. The paper itself felt ancient, as though it had been waiting decades for the right hands to claim it. And the money was real enough, sitting on his table like a promise of salvation, wrapped in supernatural obligation. Jan stood and walked to his window, looking out at the narrow alley below. A few lights still burned in neighboring buildings, casting yellow rectangles on the wet pavement, where cats picked their way delicately between puddles. Somewhere, a dog barked once and fell silent. The city hummed around him with its endless energy, millions of people going about their lives, unaware that in a small room above a dumpling shop, a young man was contemplating a contract that would bind him to the dead. The rational part of his mind, the part educated in science and skepticism during his truncated years in school, insisted that someone was playing an elaborate joke. Perhaps the family of this Lin Meihua had lost their daughter and found solace in ancient rituals that helped them process their grief. Perhaps they had chosen him at random, a convenient stranger to play the role of husband in their private drama of loss and remembrance. But the desperate part of his mind, the part that had been scraping coins from between couch cushions and stealing fruit from market stalls, whispered that 500 yuan was 500 yuan, whatever its source. And if playing along with this family's grief brought him the money he needed to survive another month, was that really so terrible? People did stranger things for money every day. Factory workers assembled toys for children they would never meet. Office clerks processed forms for bureaucracies they didn't understand. Was pretending to be married to a dead girl really so much worse than the other small compromises that poverty demanded? He thought about Lin Meihua, 23 years old and 3 years dead. What did she look like? What books had she read? What dreams had she cherished before illness or accident cut her life short? The contract listed her as unmarried, which meant she had died young and alone, without the comfort of a husband or the hope of children. If her family found peace in binding her spirit to his, if it helped them believe she would not spend eternity in solitude, perhaps there was kindness in accepting their offer. Perhaps there was